All right, well, again, just to remind you, we're looking at the last half of Mark. It's the creation of the kingdom, and in that connection, we're calling this the covenant being acknowledged. It's the prosecutors of Christ who will, in fact, out of their own mouths, acknowledge who he is. We've seen the Messiah alone, you'll all leave me. We've seen the Messiah agonizing, the garden prayer. Now we see the Messiah arrested. And that's the text before us here. So, while Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude, swords and clubs, came from the chief priests, scribes, and elders. Mark probably says it's while Jesus was still speaking, simply to remind us this is not a train wreck. This is not an unfortunate mishap. Nobody could have seen it coming. This is something in which Jesus, in fact, is not the victim of anybody, but is indeed in the driver's seat. And he even announces the arrival of those who are intending to betray him. Judas is given to us as one of the 12. He's the only one with Jesus who is mentioned by name in this text. And that probably, again, is intentional on Mark's part. He doesn't even tell us the name of Peter, who cuts off the guy's ear. It's only these two who are mentioned by name. He's called by Mark one of the 12. It deepens our sense of the abandonment and indeed the wound that a close friend has, as the psalmist put it, lifted up his heel against me. Mark says a great multitude came, but we need to be careful. The word for multitude here in Greek is really a word that means a crowd. I don't think we see this as hundreds of people, but probably, a crowd of maybe 20 or 30, so on. They're coming with color of authority. They're coming as if they were a vigilante group trying to seize a dangerous crook and his crowd. This is Sundance, what's the guy's name? Butch Cassidy and the Sun. We're trying to catch these people because they constantly slip through our fingers, and we've been on their trail. That's kind of the spirit of this, whereas Jesus has been nothing of the sort. He's been out there in full view of everybody quite a bit, and this need for a kind of subterfuge at night was hardly necessary. The crowd that comes seems to be hastily organized. The high priest was having to act fast here because Jesus becomes available to him much more quickly than he had expected. They thought they'd have to wait till the Passover was over. They'd have to wait several days, and then when things settled down and people were more or less leaving after the feast of Passover, then they'd grab Jesus when no one would notice. And now with Judas's help, all of a sudden they can do this much more precipitously, and so he has to put together this kind of SWAT team, you see, to show up and grab Jesus unawares, unexpecting it. That's what they thought. They come with swords and clubs. One commentator was mentioning how odd it is, the weapons of earth being marshaled against the power of heaven. I like this quote. History has taught nothing more clearly than this, that spiritual power in the world cannot be crushed with clubs. Men might as well try to beat down a ray of sunshine. The attempts have continued throughout history, however. There was the long struggle of Rome to stamp out Christianity, the long sorry tale of persecutions within Christianity, the Inquisition, the burnings, the imprisonments, the lynchings, the physical repressions of every sort. History is littered with attempts to harness the weaponry of this world to stamp out Christ and his movement. So far, hasn't worked. Here we are. But the attempts are certainly not going to go away anytime soon. Clubs may inflict pain, but clubs have never vanquished Jesus or the truth of God's word. Jesus was beaten with clubs, but after 3 days he rose again. Every physical victory of force is followed by a resurrection of truth. As I was saying, there's a corollary to the principle which goes the opposite direction. Just as the weaponry of this world cannot stamp out Christ and his message, in the same sense, the weaponry of this world is not effective in advancing the kingdom of God. We've been tempted as Christian people from time to time to try to beat people into faith. Just as they try to beat faith out of us, We've used the same tactic against them. Doesn't work either way. Jesus says, I'm going to build on this rock my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. The gates of hell don't mind a bit if we throw hand grenades at it. It has no problem dealing with bazookas or bows and arrows. All of those are ineffective against the gates of hell, but the power of the gospel of Christ is what pushes it back. And we make a grave mistake as Christians. History testifies to this. When we, on those occasions that we have political power, try to use it to force people into faith. The effect turns out to be just the opposite of what we had hoped. And this story actually gives us a good example of that as well. So here they come, from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Mark judiciously only mentions Jewish authority. John mentions in his account of this same setting that there were Roman authorities there as well. It may be that Mark is trying not to unduly antagonize the Romans. He's in fact writing to Christians who are being persecuted by Romans. He doesn't want to necessarily make it any worse than it is, at least that's one theory as to why Mark doesn't mention Romans. In any event, the betrayer had given a sign, a signal. Whomever I kiss, he's the one. Seize him, lead him away safely. So the man who was called one of the 12 in the preceding verse is now called his betrayer in this verse. And we see that sharp, dramatic tension. One of his closest friends and associates is now the one who's leading the charge against him. One of the greatest mysteries of human psychology that has ever presented itself to our speculation. Judas had provided to them a signal. The Greek word is sousemon, which literally means an agreed upon or stipulated sign. Only Mark uses this term, and it suggests that what was in mind here was a kind of sting operation. These people were going to be sneaking in. Judas would walk up, business as usual. Rabbi, great to see you, you see, and then he would immediately signal Jesus as the one they needed to apprehend. And so it seems as if something like that was going on. Judas had given the sign, whoever I kiss. I don't know how many times in the history of art there have been attempts to capture the moment of the kiss of Judas. This is one of the more famous, a painting by Giotto. Giotto is famous because he is a bridge between the earlier, rather highly stylized Byzantine art of the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance art, which would be much more human. And so Giotto is about halfway in between, and in him we just begin to see an introduction of human elements of depth and of true human expression and emotion. And I've always liked this in particular because you can see Judas puckered up to give a kiss. I mean, look at that. And Jesus is looking at him like, hey, what are you doing, bucko? Do you see the, it's very interesting. I just love that. I don't know if it was anything like that, but I thought I'd just give you that for free. In any event, it does create, as you're well aware, one of the most famous incidents of human history and literature, and the expression remains with us to this day, in which we'll say someone was betrayed with a kiss. In the ancient world, in the Jewish world, the kiss was the typical greeting of respect by a disciple for the rabbi. Here, apparently, it was calculated to be a ruse, in which Judas would come up, apparently, on friendly terms, hold Jesus tight once he had him so that he could then be apprehended, as if Jesus were going to try to slip away, escape, run off into the shadows, as if Jesus had anything like that in mind. Everybody else would, but Jesus was there to be taken, only taken because he in fact permitted it and indeed intended it. So as soon as Judas had come, immediately he went up to him and said to him, Rabbi, Rabbi, and he kissed him. I liked one commentator's remark on the term kissed him. The Greek there is katapheleson auton. literally means kissed him much. This is the beginning, he continues, of the mockery of Jesus. In this incident, the kiss has become the supreme symbol of treason. In the case of Jesus, this was only the beginning. There have been great gestures of homage and devotion which go hand in hand with disloyalty. The formal honor paid to Jesus, accompanied by an actual denial of his teaching and spirit. This dark night was only the first of a long succession. To this day, people honor Christ with their lips while plotting the most anti-Christian actions in their hearts. We should always examine our hearts as to whether we betray Jesus with a kiss. They laid their hands on him, took him. One of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. So they laid their hands on him. People have been trying to lay their hands on Christ for centuries, trying to control him, domesticate him, put him under their power, maneuver him, manipulate him. Jesus will not be treated that way. He's only going in this case because he indeed allows it and permits it. But he is not to be domesticated by anybody. But Peter didn't quite get that, and so he grabbed a sword, making good on his earlier promises. Let's give him credit where credit is due. He doesn't wilt right off the bat. He said, I'll be there with you. I'll die with you if I need to. Mark, by the way, doesn't mention Peter by name. Peter probably wanted Mark to suppress that. This is one of the rare moments when Peter is a little bit heroic, and so he doesn't want any credit necessarily, although it doesn't turn out to be all that good in its outcome. This kind of mindless emotion that we all feel from time to time rarely produces much profit. What Peter does in the fray is he strikes one of the servants of the high priest. Malchus is his name. We learn that from the Apostle John, and cuts off his ear. Luke is the only one that mentions the healing of Malchus. Mark doesn't mention it. His purpose for telling us about Jesus' healings has now been satisfied, so he doesn't bother mentioning it. Luke, the physician, is very interested in how Jesus did that surgery, though. How do you put that back on there? That was quite a feat. I've always wondered about Malchus himself. He was a servant of the high priest. What impact did it have on him to have suffered this devastating blow? You can just imagine on the ground, clutching himself, crying out in pain. And Jesus, who's being arrested at the moment, nevertheless walks over, takes that severed ear, puts it back on, probably looked him in the eye. What did that do to that man? And I wonder if Malchus, the servant of the high priest, mentioned that to the high priest. I suspect he might have. And then you wonder, how come the high priest doesn't wake up and smell the coffee? How is it that such a mad, angry, vicious passion can maintain itself in the face of such good? I don't know. But this is a remarkable moment that lurks in the background of this story. One commentator made, I thought, an interesting comment. He said, how many times has a Christian show of force robbed a man of ears to hear the gospel of Christ? Those occasions when Christian people have been tempted, as they have sometimes in history, to take up the force of this world and extort faith out of people, generally has the effect of robbing them of the ability to hear the gospel at all, and simply instilling in them a kind of anger, resentment, and bitterness against Christ that is one of the most tragic effects of this misguided strategy. Well, Jesus answered them and said, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? Jesus, of course, with the power of a mere question, rips the mask off the motives here, reminding them he was with them daily in the temple, teaching. You didn't seize me then, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. They had plenty of opportunities. If Jesus was a criminal, a rabble-rouser, breaching the peace, otherwise breaking the law, they had plenty of opportunity to put him in cuffs, read him his rights, and haul him away out there in public, but no. Because, of course, the people loved hearing him teach. And fear of the crowds drove these religious leaders who walked a tightrope in which, on the one hand, they wanted to lord it over the common people, and on the other hand, they desperately needed their respect and admiration and support. And so while they have to appear to be superior to everyone, at the same time, they are beholden to them, and they didn't want to mess with Jesus, who was obviously gaining such traction in the popular sentiment. Jesus says the scriptures must be fulfilled, probably thinking of Isaiah 53, which discusses this one, the suffering servant, led away as a lamb to the slaughter, and that may be what they had in mind. So anyway, the disciples forsook Jesus and fled. They had all accepted the cup from Jesus. They had all pledged him their lives, and now they all abandoned him, as he predicted when it mattered. Although Peter and John, we know, followed at a distance, and Peter actually winds up in the courtyard a little later. And now this one. A certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. It's mentioned twice. The young man laid hold of him, left the linen cloth, and fled from them naked. It's been the common view, it's the view of your Sunday school teacher, that the man who is being referred to is Mark, who's probably in his mid-teenage years, and this is a little cameo appearance in a very non-heroic fashion, showing up in the story, kind of like an artist signing his name, down in the corner of a painting, something like that. We have every reason to believe that the Passover celebration took place at the home where Mark resided. We hear of this big house with a large upper room and so on many other times in the New Testament, especially in the book of Acts. And it does appear as we triangulate this that was his home, and it was his mother and maybe his father. The father's never mentioned, who were actually the masters of the home. If that's the case, then Mark was very likely present at the Last Supper, because certainly more than just the 12 were there. There was extended family and probably some kids. That would be a typical Passover celebration. It may be that Mark had retired when Jesus was leaving with his disciples, heading off toward the Mount of Olives. Mark goes to bed. He's maybe dozed off to sleep, and he hears this crowd coming by. What I'm giving you is at least what I think is a plausible explanation. This is not in the Bible, but it's at least a way to try to put a frame on this very strange little set of verses. If that happened that way, Judas brought the crowd back to that very place, thinking he might find Jesus there. Jesus is not there. And so he goes to the typical haunt of Jesus and the disciples, which is out in the Garden of Gethsemane. But of course, Mark probably hears the ruckus in the street, wonders what's going on, grabs this bed sheet and wraps it around him and goes out taking a look, and may in fact then have started following along. Interesting word that's used for linen cloth. It's the word Sindona, which comes from the name of the city where it was manufactured, Sidon, which is up in Phoenicia, and this was one of many rather luxurious products that were put out by that particular city. And so it suggests that Mark was in a family that had some wealth. And we've seen a little suggestion of that elsewhere as well. So he has this very nice linen cloth wrapped around him, and he's heading off, kind of following in the shadows, wanting to find out what in the world is going on. Well, when he arrives and this ruckus breaks out, and Peter's wielding a sword and everybody's fleeing, Mark runs. He's fully as unheroic as Peter. Well, Peter is more heroic at this moment. He's as unheroic as... In other words, Mark is not trying to pay himself any compliments at this point. He wants to make this little appearance because that's his right as the author of this document. And at the same time, he doesn't want anyone to think he's trying to paint himself in more glowing terms than is appropriate. So he shares the panic that everyone else felt at the moment. Interestingly, this is a bit of a pattern for Mark. You may recall that Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey took Mark along as an assistant. He bolted when they were just barely underway, really, and headed back. Too much heat in the kitchen for him, apparently. So much so, you may recall, that Paul said, "I'm not taking that flake with me again." And Barnabas said, "Yeah, but he's my nephew." And Paul and Barnabas split over the question. Remember that from the book of Acts. And so Paul took Silas, and they went off across what we call Turkey, and Barnabas took Mark, and they went back to Cyprus. And we don't hear of Mark again until much later in Paul's life, when he has the most complimentary things to say about Mark. And this young man, who was probably pretty timid in his youth, nevertheless steeled himself over the years and became a much better man. Indeed, the man who, in his genius, wrote this Gospel of Mark, and the man who Paul himself refers to as someone who is a great support and help and encouragement. And Paul writes that in some of the last of his writings. This interesting reference to being naked is a little bit jarring to us, of course. It is reflective of an Old Testament idea that to be naked is really a picture of being under judgment. Once sin enters the picture, nakedness goes hand in hand with that kind of shameful judgment associated with the idea that we are exposed to the wrath of God. And there's many texts in the Old Testament that suggest this. This is one. I'm not going to read it because my time is getting away from me already. But just notice the last sentence of this quote: "The most courageous men of might shall flee naked in that day." Many texts like that carry out that theme. It's one of many sort of judgment motifs in the Old Testament. And so Mark, once again, to kind of paint himself in unheroic terms, and indeed as one who deserved even some judgment for the behavior that he's involved in at this point. I might also just mention in passing, the Greek word for naked here doesn't necessarily mean fully in the buff. It's a broader word, and it can in fact stand for the idea of being stripped of your normal clothing, stripped down to your underwear or your, in this case, maybe PJs or something. So, we need to at least bring a little bit of that color to the text as well. But one way or another, that's been at least one plausible thought about how that could have happened quite that way. All right, we need to cover this much more. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, the scribes were assembled. Peter had followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with guards warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many gave false testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and said, giving false testimony, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I'll build it another and not made with hands.'" I kind of botched that, but you got the point. Even on this point, their testimony did not agree. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" And that's where we're going to leave our conversation this week. And by the way, I think I'll just drop this in. We're not meeting next week. Next week is Easter project. This room is going to be filled with auction items, so bring your checkbooks, spend a lot of money. We'll send our kids to Tijuana. We will be back in 2 weeks and find out how this question was answered, but right now we'll just leave it hanging there. So the Messiah arrested now leads us to the Messiah arraigned. He's brought into this situation where the charges against him are going to be announced. Jesus was led away to the high priest. Assembled there were the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. The high priest was Caiaphas, the son-in-law of the former high priest who had been deposed by the Romans. He held that office for 12 years, from 18 to 36 AD, right through the time frame that's involved here. It may have been the family of Annas that had paid Judas the 30 pieces of silver, not an inconsiderable sum of money. So he's the high priest that is in view right at the moment. The place where this took place is not the chamber of hewn stone, which is the normal venue for gatherings of the parliamentary body known as the Sanhedrin. Rather, it was the home, we're told, of Caiaphas. That home does not exist anymore. Rather, in its place is what's called St. Peter of Gallicantu, which means St. Peter of the cock crowing, because that was where he heard the rooster crowing. So if you're ever visiting Jerusalem, you might want to drop by here. Very interestingly, in the basement underneath, you have this area that's carved out, which was obviously used for brief imprisonments. And there is also there, in that downstairs area, some pillars where people could actually be lashed up and beaten. And we learn a little later in this very text that that's what happened to Jesus. So he's being questioned under torture. This is not the Roman scourging, much worse, that's going to take place later, but it's the beginning of this process in which Jesus is exposed to this kind of abuse. So this is a picture of what you'll find under that house. The proceeding itself was highly illegal and irregular in virtually every respect. Experts who've looked at this have identified at least 14 violations of due process in terms of how Jesus was handled. The proceeding took place at night. That was illegal. It took place during a religious festival. That was illegal. It lacked, presumably, a quorum. That was illegal. There were no defense witnesses brought in or even permitted, apparently. That was illegal. Only the prosecution witnesses spoke, and they didn't agree with each other. And in capital cases, you had to have at least two witnesses that agreed in the details of their testimony to convict. So they lacked that as well. The charge brought against Jesus that he claimed to be Messiah was not even a crime, let alone a capital offense. Many people ran around claiming to be the Messiah. They weren't arrested, tried, convicted, and executed for doing such a thing. But this is what's used against Jesus as a claim against him. The precipitous speed with which Jesus was condemned and executed during a festival, all of it, was just over the top, a complete repudiation of what was in fact one of the most well-defined systems of jurisprudence and due process that had ever been seen in the history of the human race to that time in history. And so the whole thing really smacks of something very different from any sort of what we would call fair trial. One commentator said this really amounted to a private examination in camera conducted secretly by Jesus' powerful enemies who were really just looking for grounds to denounce him to Pilate. Who were the people involved? The chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. The trustee of this remarkably advanced system of due process, now disregarding it with actually no attempt even to make a modicum of respect, tip their hat even to what rules should normally apply. One commentator said, it's worth noting here that Jesus is not actually the one on trial, but the Sanhedrin and later Pilate. This again is a scene that I think you know has been depicted many times in the history of art. This is an 1881 painting by Mihaly Munkaci, and it shows Jesus at this point in front of Pilate, but the crowd is still there accusing him. The commentator continues, so it is, many want to put Jesus on trial in our civilization, but it is our civilization that is on trial before him. It's also notable that Jesus was on trial by the most enlightened religious institutions of his day. This has been a repeated theme in history. Whenever the religious institutions gained the wealth and favor and political influence of this world, the hierarchy feared the loss of privilege, financial as well as political, far more than it feared God. A high redeeming fear of God had been traded for a small damning one, fear of people. No one wanted a disturber, and Jesus was certainly that. Hence Jesus' warning, watch and pray that you do not enter into temptation. Back at the ranch, Peter followed at a distance into the courtyard of the high priest, sat with the servants. He had a hoodie on, you might can imagine that. So he's trying to keep himself incognito. This is the home of Caiaphas. The architecture typically was a horseshoe affair in which there'd be an open area out in front where the fire was burning to keep people warm. I imagine Peter may have looked a little bit ill at ease sitting out there. He probably saw that Malchus go walking by that he had chopped off his ear a little while ago. He probably saw some others that had actually been out there present when Jesus was arrested. He sees some that would soon be mocking Jesus. He's sitting there in a very odd situation, probably still trying to calculate in his mind, how can he be heroic? How can he step up and make good on his earlier promises? I'm sure he was entertaining some thoughts like that. He was warming himself, as literally, pros to phos, toward the light. And so his face is illumined by the fire, even as he's sitting out there. And of course, he'll be recognized soon enough by some others that are in that vicinity. Meantime, downstairs, the chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. Mark says it's all the council. That's hyperbole. I think we have every reason to doubt that the entire Sanhedrin was gathered together at that time. It certainly suggests there was unanimity among those who were present. It's also unlikely that the entire Sanhedrin was present, because we know Jesus had at least some friendly voices on the Sanhedrin. Nicodemus had visited him, and we have every reason to believe had become a believer in Jesus, though probably still rather quiet. Joseph of Arimathea, Gamaliel, others would likely have voiced a protest. They were principled individuals who would have realized that this kangaroo court had no place in Jewish jurisprudence. But those who were the most hostile and concerted in their attempts to get at Jesus were probably the ones who were participating. Jim Edwards says, quote, the Sanhedrin sacrificed its best jurisprudence to the overriding concept of the nation's greater good, what we call national security today, resulting in a travesty of justice and the condemnation of an innocent man to death. The Sanhedrin had done this a few times. James the Just, as he's called, James the brother of Jesus, we're told by Josephus, was put together in a very similar kind of proceeding in the year 62. So almost 40 years later, we have the Sanhedrin still doing this. I don't need to remind you, good Presbyterians, that even though what's happening here on the face of it looks like bad people doing bad things to a good man, and that somehow something somewhere has just lost track of things and it's going out of control, all of this is happening according to the precise will of God, and that's the universal testimony of the New Testament. So even though as we read the story unfolding, we are aghast at these things, nevertheless we understand in the greater scheme of things, this is exactly what had to happen. When Peter stood up on the day of Pentecost and preached the first Christian sermon, he said this, Acts chapter 2, "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by miracles, wonders, and signs which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. Him, being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, you took by lawless hands, crucified and put to death." God's determined purpose working through lawless hands. And if we didn't quite get it, chapter 3 of Acts says, when Peter is addressing a crowd after a man was healed, "And now, brethren, I know that you did it in ignorance, as did your rulers, but these things God foretold by the mouth of all his prophets, that the Christ would suffer, thus he has fulfilled." And if we still don't quite get it, Acts chapter 4, when we find Peter and John have just returned from standing in front of that same Sanhedrin that had executed Jesus, they go back to their Christian fellowship, and in prayer they say the following, "For truly your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate with the Gentiles and the people of Israel were gathered together to do whatever your hand and your purpose determined before to be done." It's a great mystery to us how God can use evil means to accomplish good outcomes. And we, by the way, since we are not God, are not authorized to do that. We cannot adopt an ends justifies the means sort of ethic, but God, being God, is sovereign. And so when Joseph said to his brothers, "What you intended for harm, God intended for good," we can say, okay, if God is God, then he has the perfect right to do that, even though to us it's a mystery quite how he does it. And certainly the New Testament sees what's happening here, not simply as something God is permitting, but that God is actually ordering, commanding for the purpose of our redemption. Well, many bore false testimony against him, but their testimonies did not agree. It's been true of every generation. I like the comment from one who was saying that just as Christ was subjected to conflicting accusations, those who have aligned themselves with Jesus have subjected themselves to the same kind of conflicting accusations, and we see it all through history. This commentator said, quote, "Today some say Christianity is subversive with dangerous radicalism. Others scorn Christianity as romantic delusion. Still others say Christian teaching narrows and cripples life, spoiling freedom. Marx claimed it was the opiate of the people. Some charge the church with being too otherworldly, others with being too secular. Some say it's too dogmatic, some say it's too wishy-washy. Would you please get your story straight? What exactly is it that we're doing wrong here? Because you've heard every conceivable accusation brought against Christ and his movement down through history. And it just makes you wonder, where is that really coming from?" Candy and I came across a quote this past week, maybe you did too, by a radical feminist commenting on the recent death of Billy Graham. And she used language so vitriolic and hateful and obscene, I could not repeat it in Sunday school, and I would never say it in polite conversation. And you wonder, is that some kind of detached, sober assessment of one of the most influential personalities? Regarded, in fact, during his lifetime, was regarded as one of the 10 most admired men in America? I don't think so. I think what you see in an accusation like this from a journalist saying such things in print is nothing less than what you'd have to call hellish and diabolical. It is the hatred of hell itself. And they will, in fact, throw anything at the wall, hoping something will stick when it comes to accusing Jesus and accusing those who align themselves with him of any bad thing they can think of to try to cripple the effect of the Christian message. And we certainly see a little bit of that here, and it hasn't stopped, nor will it anytime soon. The question sometimes asked, who witnessed this proceeding? Don't know. Could have been John. We're told elsewhere that John himself his family was known to the family of the high priest. It was a prominent family. He could have just insinuated himself based on his good looks, you know. He might have been downstairs watching this. We don't know. Could have been a later convert on the Sanhedrin. We know that many of those who were in fact involved in accusing and executing Jesus actually eventually became firm believers in him. Many of the Pharisee class became believers. So it's possible, we don't know, but certainly the message, the story we're told certainly fits with what otherwise we would assume took place. We're told their testimonies did not agree. That's the way it goes with most conspiracies. I mentioned earlier, Jewish law required that in capital cases at least 2 witnesses agree in the details of their testimony or the guy goes free. In this case, Mark tells us they could never get their story straight. But the problem is here, the judgment was a foregone conclusion. This was a trial with a prearranged prejudice, that is, pre-judgment. The question wasn't whether Jesus would be found guilty. The question was simply, how do we get from here to there? You know, how do we get to a point where he can be denounced to Pilate? Some rose up and bore false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands.'" Now, Jesus never said that, at least on the biblical record. He did say some things that were at least distantly corollary to it. So these 2 guys that Matthew mentions, Mark doesn't tell us there were 2, are saying something that at least had some connection to something Jesus had said. Jesus said, for example, in John's Gospel, we have this, chapter 2, the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign do you show us, since you do these things?" Jesus answered and said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews said, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple, Herod's temple. Will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body, the true temple, the temple that Jesus is at this very moment creating. The new covenant creates a kingdom and a temple, and it happens to be an organic temple, a living temple, and he's the cornerstone of it. And so this is not Jesus saying, I'm going to destroy this temple and then build it in 3 days. The other text that is at least distantly connected to that accusation is in Mark. He went out of the temple. One of the disciples said to him, Teacher, see what manner of stones, what buildings are here? Jesus answered and said, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. So Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple, but again, he doesn't quite say what is being accused here. There is one ancient source, the Gospel of Thomas, that has the closest connection. This is non-canonical, of course, but it does go clear back to early 2nd century, where the Gospel of Thomas puts these words in Jesus' mouth. Jesus said, I will destroy this house, and no one will be able to build it again. And in some ways, you might say there's a bit of truth in it. Jesus did pronounce judgment on the temple. Behold, your house is left to you desolate. Jesus did say this house is going to be left a wasteland. Not one stone is going to be left upon another. And the strong implication, of course, is that temple would never be rebuilt, never will be rebuilt, in my opinion, dispensational theology notwithstanding. The true temple is the temple of God's people. You are the temple of God. You are the residency of God in this world. Christ is the cornerstone. We are pillars in it. We are rocks in it. We are stones in it. But it is a living temple that is now carrying the message of the kingdom of God to the world. Well, we end up here. Not even then did their testimony agree. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you? Do you answer nothing? Jesus sitting there, at least so far, in silence. If you're curious as to what happens next, boys and girls, you need to come back. And it's going to be in 2 weeks, and we'll find out just what happens from this point. But briefly, Sunday school lessons. The call on the Christian's life is not to be heroic, but faithful. There have been heroic spirits in the history of the Christian movement, but God has never called you to be a hero. He has called all of us to be faithful. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4, let a man so consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it's required in stewards that a man be found faithful. Therefore, judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness and reveal the counsels of the hearts. Then each one's praise will come from God. So faithfulness, point number one. Number two, Christian faithfulness requires relying on weapons of heaven, not earth. We have weapons as Christian people, but those weapons don't look like hand grenades or bazookas or other weaponry of this world. Sometimes those weapons are necessary. The church has traditionally taken a just war theory. That's a whole different question. But when it comes to advancing the kingdom, when it comes to spreading the news of Christ around the world, those weapons are less than useless. There are more powerful weapons at our disposal. The Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians, though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God, for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. And finally, the purposes of heaven will be realized, though it may at times come through lawless hands. That's why we can take comfort when we see in this world sometimes lawless hands seeming to have their way, and certainly we have a role to rise up in holy protest when it's appropriate to do so, but we should never think that God himself is in heaven wringing his hands and wondering, what am I going to do now? What a mess! This is not a situation in which God finds himself. Paul gives a profound comment on this in Romans chapter 9. What if God, wanting to show his wrath and make his power known, endured with much long suffering vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, so that he might make known the riches of his glory on vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory, even us, who he called, not from the Jews only, but even from us Gentiles.